This is Rob Foley, Senior Research Fellow at the Sustainable Endowments Institute, and welcome to today's webinar, Advanced Strategies and Analytics for Campus Green Revolving Funds. This is a co-hosted webinar today by the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, as well as SEI, and we're really glad that everyone's here. And I just want to let you know that this webinar will run about an hour. Today, we have been very grateful to be able to work with AASHE and all of our partner organizations on the resources that you'll see in this webinar. And today we have some great presenters for you, John Onderdonk and Matt Burbet from Caltech, and Joe Invik from the firm ICF International, and one of the lead authors on the implementation guide. And they're going to present on today's webinar. First, I will be giving a brief introduction of the Green Revolving Fund concept and SEI's work in this field, as well as talking about the implementation guide, the main resource that's being featured on today's webinar. Next, Joe will be giving a presentation on both fund analytics and measurement and verification of project savings within the context of Green Revolving Funds. After that, we'll have John and Matt giving a joint presentation about the structure and management of the Caltech Energy Conservation Investment Program, or CCIP, which is Caltech's Green Revolving Fund, and it's something that fund is featured in our implementation guide that this webinar is sort of announcing the launch of today. And lastly, we'll have some time, probably about 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So this webinar is, as many of you may know, is part of a series. Back in January of this year, SEI and AASHE co-published an introductory guide to implementation and management, and that was a shorter version of an implementation guide about green revolving funds, GRFs, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And that guide had much of the same content that's in a full guide that we released in August, about 2 months ago. But we added more content to the August guide. We made it more technical and more complex and focused more on some of the nitty-gritty issues that fund managers are going to encounter. We also had a webinar for the introductory guide back in April of this year, and so this webinar today is the second in a series that is going to be talking about more in-depth issues. If you're interested in looking at all of these resources, including an archive both of the PowerPoint slides and the presentation of the earlier webinar, which talks more broadly about green revolving funds, you can learn more on AASHE or SEI's websites. And the link for the SEI website is at the bottom, greenbillion.org/resources. So talking more about the $1 Billion Green Challenge, which is the initiative that SEI has launched that is promoting green revolving funds, I just wanted to give a brief history so that people know the context that this webinar is in. The challenge was launched at AASHE in Pittsburgh in 2011, and it is a call for colleges and universities to invest in their own self-managed green revolving funds, which will finance energy efficiency projects on campus and use the savings from those projects to finance further savings producing projects. And the $1 Billion Green Challenge aims to have as many colleges and universities as possible adopt green revolving funds with the goal of a combined fund size or aggregate of all of their funds of $1 billion. It's a very lofty goal, but it's something we're working to meet. And here I've just got up a screenshot of our website, which has many resources and other webinars that are archived if you're interested. It's greenbillion.org. Feel free to check it out. And in the lower right-hand corner, we've put on 2 conferences, Financing the Future of Energy Efficiency, and this is a picture of the lobby entrance to the second one, which was in San Diego of this year, back in April. So the Green Revolving Fund model is, as I mentioned before, we've got a diagram below which talks about how revolving fund projects identify areas on campus that there is some sort of economic inefficiency as well as an environmental inefficiency, and they target those areas to have projects which are going to save the university resources or energy, and those savings translate into monetary savings, as in part 2 of the photo. And part 3, over time, those savings revolve back into the fund and are able to replenish it, and then it can fund more projects. This is a very broad model. There's lots of different fund types within it, but the 2 criteria that we use for a green revolving fund is that it must finance some sort of environmental conservation measure, and the second one is that it must have a formalized revolving component. so that the institution is committed to taking those savings and putting them back into future green projects. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the guide and the process that we used to come up with this resource so folks know where we're getting our data. We drew on a lot of different areas to put together this implementation guide and a lot of the insights that you'll learn about today in the webinar, interviews with stakeholders, and there's some types listed here that are running green revolving funds at various types of colleges and universities across the US and Canada. We also used research, including Greening the Bottom Line, which is a census report about all of the green revolving funds in higher education, as well as the experience of folks that have implemented green revolving funds themselves and who were authors on the guide. So the full implementation guide includes the following chapters on your left. To save time, I'm not going to go through all of them. You can find the guide on our website, and I encourage you to read it for yourself. But it does define in very lots of detail what the Green Revolving Fund concept is, and Chapter 3 provides 10 steps to build one yourself and plan and design a Green Revolving Fund. And then Chapters 4 and 5 are new to the full version of the implementation guide, which was released this past August, and it's going to be the focus of today's webinar. I won't say much more because that's what our presenters will get into in a moment. And I also wanted to let folks know about upcoming opportunities. As most of you know, I'm sure, next week is the AASHE 2013 conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've taken the photo collage from their website. It's really beautiful, and it promises to be a really exciting and educational event. I encourage everybody to check out AASHE's website and attend the conference and think about what workshops you'd like to go to. On the right are a few examples of the ones that deal with green revolving funds. If this is an issue you're very interested in, definitely look those up. And specifically, those are highlighted on our website at greenbillion.org/events. And at this point, excuse me, at this point, I'm going to transition to the presentations. Joe Invick will be going first. And I want to remind everybody that you're muted, but you can use the chat box on the right-hand pane to send me your questions during the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many as possible as we can during the Q&A. Next up is Joe Invick, who is a lead author on the implementation guide and a consultant for the firm ICF International. Joe, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Can you see my screen okay and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. Hello, everybody. As Rob mentioned, my name is Joe Invick, and I work on energy efficiency and sustainability strategy at ICF International. And I've actually been working on green revolving funds for about 4 years now, first as a student at Dartmouth, where we established $1 million GRF, and then as an independent consultant at Dartmouth, and now as a consultant at ICF. And as Rob mentioned, I'm the lead author on the GRF implementation guide that's serving as the kind of basis for this talk. So now that we've covered the basics in the first webinar and in Rob's presentation, I'm really excited to jump into some advanced strategies for green revolving funds. So what we want to do over the next 30 minutes is really build out your practical toolkit for using data to track, design, and manage a green revolving fund. We aim to convince you that good, solid data management is usually at the core of a successful GRF. So I'm going to walk you through some basic fund analytics, provide some guidance on performing measurement and verification, and tell you what is essentially a cautionary tale of two funds that will help illustrate the importance of good modeling when it comes to designing your fund. And then we're going to hear from, frankly, two of my biggest heroes at Caltech, who are going to talk about how their GRF is really taking data analysis to the next level. So I'm really excited for that. So first, let's talk about some fund analytics that can be used to evaluate, select, and track projects within the context of a GRF. So in the discussions we've had with a couple of dozen different fund managers to develop this guide, there were really 4 key financial metrics that are most commonly used. And I'm going to briefly walk you through each one, discuss some pros and cons, and then talk about potential uses for each of those metrics. Now, many of you are going to be familiar with these, but I really want to talk about them specifically within the context of a GRF. So the first is the ever popular payback period, which is simply the time in years that it takes a project to repay its original cost with savings. This metric has the advantage of being very quick, easy, and understandable, and it's actually very commonly used. In fact, about half the universities that we surveyed use this as an explicit project selection criterion. But that simplicity really comes at a cost. Payback period doesn't capture more nuanced information like the opportunity cost of capital or the total volume of savings achieved. The second metric is return on investment, or ROI. This metric is usually expressed on an annual basis as the percentage of a project's total cost that is recouped in a given year via its savings. It can also be expressed as a lifetime return on investment for the entire duration of the project. So one really interesting advantage of ROI is that it can be directly compared to other investments that generate annual returns, such as the endowment. So for example, the median ROI generated by higher education GRFs is about 28%, and that compares very favorably when you put it up against endowment returns. For example, if you're trying to convince the administration to reallocate capital away from the endowment and towards energy efficiency. And that's all well and good, but you need to be wary of one caveat. So investing in the stock market is not the same thing as investing in a GRF. When a GRF spends capital, it purchases fixed assets like light bulbs or boilers or what have you. And those assets do have value and they do go on the books and are depreciated over time, but they're typically not liquid, right? You can't resell a boiler the next year if you decide you want that money back. Investments in stocks and other financial vehicles can usually be resold in a liquid fashion as conditions change. So while it's the exercise of comparing investment returns to GRF returns is certainly valuable and helps to illustrate the business case for energy efficiency, you need to be aware that it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison when you walk into the CFO's office and sort of make that case. And of course, return on investment has some of the same disadvantages as payback period. The third metric is a little bit more complicated. It's net present value, and it essentially represents the total net savings generated over the lifetime of the project once you've adjusted the cost of capital, once you've adjusted that total for the cost of capital and risk by incorporating a discount rate. So it's a much more nuanced measure of profitability than the first two metrics, and it has the added benefit of capturing the total volume of savings being achieved. However, it's pretty unintuitive for non-technical audiences, and it ultimately hinges on the somewhat arbitrary selection of a discount rate. So be sure to carefully consider the implications of the discount rate if you're doing NPV calculations within the context of a GRF. And the fourth metric is internal rate of return, or IRR. So IRR is really a more nuanced version of ROI. And it's defined as the discount rate that sets NPV equal to 0. So in other words, it represents the profitability of a project in the presence of discounting expressed as an annual return. So IRR has the advantage of incorporating, again, the time value of money, i.e. discounting. And it also conveniently allows you to establish a hurdle rate, which is a minimum acceptable rate of return that's based on the cost of capital and the risk that your institution is willing to tolerate in terms of returns. So much like a payback period, some schools use a hurdle rate as a minimum acceptable level of return. So Arizona State University is actually a great example of a school that uses a threshold hurdle rate as well as some other financial metrics to assess projects. And we feature ASU's project selection process in the guide. So I'd encourage you to check that out. Again, IRR does have a couple of advantages. It's quite unintuitive to non-technical audiences again, and it does not account for the total volume of savings achieved. So I spent the last couple of minutes going down a quantitative rabbit hole, as it were, but it's important to occasionally come up for air. So remember that when you're pitching a GRF, you're going to get a lot of questions like this, right? The majority of your audience is not going to have a background in finance, so it's also important to use data to tell a good story about your fund that everybody's going to be able to understand. And to that effect, I'd like to show you one example of a really simple but compelling graphic that any fund can use to demonstrate its performance. So this is an example of a portfolio analysis. In other words, it represents the combined performance of all projects financed by a given GRF. The approach works whether you are forecasting future performance or tracking past performance, and graphics like this can certainly be used in fund proposals as well. The graph is actually modified from an analysis I did for Dartmouth CFO a couple of years ago. The green line represents the total balance of money in the GRF projects. And I think this graph tells three really interesting stories. I mean, first, the fund balance line illustrates how capital is flowing out of the fund to finance projects. As you can see, it decline whenever a project is financed. And then how the savings from those projects are recouped back into the fund. And this is a great way, if you have any stakeholders who don't quite understand how this whole revolving concept is going to work, this can be a great way to demonstrate how savings from past projects are going to be leveraged into future projects. The second story that this tells is how total savings increase at a faster and faster rate over time as the project portfolio grows. So this really illustrates how a GRF can magnify the impact of original dollars invested into an increasing curve of savings over time. And third, the graph actually shows you, if you look closely, the break-even point for the fund as a whole, the month in which total cumulative savings exceed the initial capital allocation to the fund. So you can see that this hypothetical example starts in July 2012 and achieves $1 million in total savings around July 2014. So in other words, we can say that the fund as a whole has a 2-year payback period. So overall, I think this kind of representation can be a good way to demonstrate the business case for your fund without getting into some of the other complicated financial metrics that we discussed before. There we go. I want to change gears a little bit now and talk about actually measuring the performance of projects. So not conducting financial analysis, but rather measuring the actual number of kilowatt hours conserved or BTUs reduced. There are lots of good resources out there on measurement and verification of project savings, or M&V as it's commonly known. So I won't get into that in detail. I'm just going to provide a quick overview and then talk through the really interesting issue, which is deciding how to use M&V in the context of a GRF, or in some cases, whether to use M&V at all. So generally speaking, M&V is conducted by establishing a consumption baseline. So the baseline represents how much energy would have been consumed in the absence of the upgrade, while also controlling for other conflating factors like weather and occupancy patterns. And once the upgrade is complete, the actual consumption is measured, and the difference between the baseline and the actual is the project savings. So in sum, M&V allows you to see how much you're really saving relative to a business as usual scenario, even in the event that consumption is fluctuating due to factors that you can't control. So if you're new to M&V, the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol, or IPMVP, is a good place to start. And it lays out 4 basic options for how you can conduct M&V for a given project. And we cover those in detail in the guide, and you can also just Google IPMVP to find out more. I'm not going to go into detail on these now, but I want you to be aware that these resources exist. And then in the guide also, we synthesize IPMVP guidance into a decision tree that can help you decide which M&V option is right for you for a particular project based on a variety of different parameters. So again, I won't go into this now, but please take a look at this in the guide if you are interested. But the really interesting question is how to use M&V in the context of a GRF. And we find there's actually a pretty strong battle line that's been drawn in this debate. So we have some institutions that only rely on upfront estimates of savings to determine repayments to their GRF, and they make no effort to precisely measure or verify those savings. And those institutions often claim that M&V is too costly or that they're confident enough in the savings and that measurement is not required. Other institutions actively use M&V to determine repayments into the fund, and they often cite the many benefits of getting good granular data out of a consistent M&V program. We're actually lucky enough to have 2 gentlemen from Caltech who are really at the cutting edge of M&V on the call with us today, and you'll hear from them in a little bit. But for you all, as you think through M&V at your institution, I'll just quickly review some of the key pros, cons, and considerations that have come up as we've interviewed fund managers about this topic around North America. So in terms of benefits, beyond the technical benefits of M&V, it can actually be very helpful in building confidence among stakeholders that the savings from energy efficiency are real, particularly if you have some stick-in-the-mud administrators who don't necessarily see the business case for energy efficiency right away. Second, it provides some protection against cost overruns resulting from poor performance. So for example, if a project underperforms, but those issues go unnoticed, a project recipient under a GRF may actually find themselves obligated to repay more to the fund than they're saving on an annual basis. So conducting M&V allows you to peg repayments directly to the actual savings and avoid that pitfall. And third, beyond repayments, M&V is just generally a good way to detect and correct issues with poorly performing equipment. And fourth, M&V gives you good information about which technologies work well on your campus over time and which have experienced setbacks. So that information can be useful over time to prioritize projects moving forward. Now the cons are pretty straightforward, but I'll run through them real quickly. Of course, it can be expensive to conduct M&V, especially if you have to purchase meters or bring in outside talent. It can also be a burden on in-house staff, particularly if they are not already trained to do M&V. And also, it's worth noting that M&V can't just be conducted willy-nilly. It really requires some advanced planning to ensure that meters are in place and that they're being monitored in advance of the retrofits. So the big question is to measure or not to measure, and there's a few key things to examine as you make that decision. So first, look at the politics surrounding energy efficiency at your institution. If you've got some of those senior leaders I was talking about who are just not convinced that the business case for efficiency is real, then M&V can be very helpful in convincing them that it is. Second, evaluate how your budgeting process works. If there are going to be severe adverse consequences in the event that actual savings don't match expected, then M&V is going to help you mitigate that risk. Also look at the size of the project. So for smaller projects, typically, M&V does not scale down, the costs of M&V do not scale linearly with the size of projects. So M&V becomes a disproportionately large portion of project cost for smaller projects. So you may think about establishing a project size floor under which M&V will not be conducted. And also think about the technology type in question. So if it's a piece of reliable equipment with a strong track record, you might want to skip M&V. But if it's a newer or more complex project, you might want to measure to ensure that underperformance can be caught and corrected quickly. A few more ideas to consider. One is think about phasing out M&V over time if you're concerned about the cost. Even if you perform it on the first few rounds of projects, it might be possible to scale it back over time to keep costs low. You might also think about a payment ceiling. So we're seeing examples of schools who are basically conducting M&V and then also performing an upfront estimate of what the savings will be, and then simply taking the lower value. So whichever number is lower, that's the amount that gets repaid to the fund. If you do pursue M&V, think about establishing a proactive kind of rolling metering plan to ensure that you have meters installed in all buildings in advance of the retrofits. And finally, on a kind of a more philosophical level, consider thinking about M&V as an investment. So as you gain experience conducting M&V over time across a range of GRF projects, you'll build up a database of successes, challenges, and lessons learned, and that information can be useful in tailoring your fund strategy moving forward and to shifting your priorities if necessary. So I'll stop there on the M&V front. As I said, we're all really lucky to have the folks from Caltech on the line who are going to give us some great perspective on just how powerful M&V can be in a little bit. But before I turn it over to Caltech, I want to tell you one interesting story that I think really brings together everything we've talked about so far. So this is an actionable but cautionary tale that shows how important it is to confirm your institution, or your intuition, I should say, about how a GRF will work with a healthy dose of analysis. So imagine we've got two hypothetical GRFs at two different institutions. Okay, both funds are going to start with $1 million in capital. And for simplicity's sake, let's assume these two funds are going to finance only $600,000 projects with a 3-year payback. So each fund will wait until it's recouped enough capital from its previous projects to finance a new version of this project, and so on and so forth. Fund number one, there's going to be a few differences between these funds. So fund number one is going to have projects repay 100% of their savings annually. So let's imagine that fund number one is conducting M&V on each project, and so the school is confident that 100% of the savings are going to be repaid. Under the fund, the projects have a total repayment obligation of 120%, which is something we see occasionally in the higher education space, meaning that the fund is going to gain a 20% return plus the original principal with each round of investment. Now, fund number two only requires 90% of projects' annual savings to be repaid. So let's imagine the fund is not using M&V, and as a result, it has built in a buffer of 10% to reduce the risk that actual performance will not match expected performance. And also, fund number two only requires projects to repay 100% of their initial cost, after which all savings will be absorbed back into the operating budget. So another way to put this is that fund number one is slightly more aggressive in its repayment requirements, and fund number two is slightly less aggressive. So the interesting question to ask is, how is the performance of these two funds going to differ over a 10-year period due to those small changes in design? So I built this out in a simple model in Excel. It really only takes you about an hour to do this, and the results are pretty interesting. So let's look at the total number of projects that each fund implements first, a very simple metric. So we see that fund number one is going to grow steadily over time, and it implements 8 projects by the end of year 10. By comparison, fund number two is only going to implement 5 projects by the end of year 10. So why such a big difference in project execution given the relatively small differences in fund design? Well, it turns out the revolving effect actually magnifies these small differences into much larger differences. So in other words, fund number one is going to get paid back 10% faster, meaning that it can finance the next project 10% sooner, which then in turn pays back 10% faster, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the moment that fund number one gains a small lead in the number of projects, this compounding effect is going to cause that lead to multiply over time. And we can see that pretty clearly if I mark each project that is currently repaying the fund with an R, as I've done here. So at every moment in this model, fund number one has either an equal number or a greater number of projects repaying it than fund number two. And that gap grows wider over time. In fact, if you look at year 9, fund one has fully double the number of projects repaying it versus fund number two. So that explains much of the compounding effect. Now, projects are all kind of well and good, but what we really care about here is total savings. So we'll go ahead and graph that on the other axis. So we see that fund number one achieves between 7 million and 8 million in total savings by the end of year 10. And we see that fund number two achieves only 5 million and barely gets to 5 million at that. So to recap, despite a 10% difference in annual repayments and a 20% difference in total repayment obligation, fund number one achieves greater than 50% more total savings over a decade. And as you can see, that gap is only widening over time. So what have we learned through this little exercise? Well, I think there's 3 key points here. And the first is that we've learned that small differences in design can lead to big differences in performance. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that fund number one is superior, because remember that fund number one has more aggressive repayment requirements. So in other words, some of the dollars that must be paid back to fund one could, in the case of fund two, be used for other things like cutting operating expenses, reducing tuition, building a new building, or what have you. So I certainly don't mean to imply that a more aggressive design is always better, but it does have profound implications on performance that need to be understood and addressed at the fund design process, or at the fund design stage, I should say. And the second thing we learned from this is that modeling is super important. We've seen that our intuition about how a fund is going to work is not always borne out in reality. And mind you, we only changed a few simple variables in this analysis. So imagine how this would have changed if we looked at a different starting capital amount, or we looked at a different project portfolio, or even different criteria for projects altogether. It's really important to understand the impacts of those decisions in a real-world context. And finally, this shows, frankly, that good data analysis is not just for energy data nerds like myself. It's tempting to think of fund analytics and modeling and M&V as sort of peripheral nice-to-haves, but they're actually crucial to effective fund design and management. And without these metrics, you really are flying blind. So speaking of energy data nerds, we happen to have 2 of the greatest self-professed data nerds on the line with us today, and as I said, my personal heroes as well. So I'm really pleased to introduce Matt Rebay and John Onderdonk of Caltech, who are going to walk you through some of their exciting work in California. So please take it away, guys.
Wow, all these superlatives. I don't know if we can live up to the billing, but thank you all for joining and for having us. We're broadcasting live from our central plant, so if there's a little bit of a buzz and a hum in the background, that's the reason. Since we're energy nerds, we tend not to get too far away from the energy source. So I'll jump in, set the stage, and then Matt will talk about some of the specifics. Just to give you an overview of Caltech, a couple of key features and facts to point out as a comparison for your campuses. We have about 4 million square feet of building space and 125 acres. The campus population is about 7,000 folks, and our energy use is 120 gigawatt hours annually. And so our energy intensity, which is really what we look at, is significantly higher than our peers in the UC system. And one of the reasons is for that is all of our laboratory spaces. And so that presents us with a lot of challenges when we're going through and looking at energy efficiency, but also a lot of opportunities. So this slide's a bit redundant in that most of you sound like you're familiar with a revolving fund, but the key here is the mantra. We've tried to distill down what we believe is the most important point about our Caltech Energy Conservation Investment Program, and that is that the cost to the utility budget does not change. So what changes is the portion that goes to the utility bills and the portion to debt service. And so we have some charts in a little bit that explain that, but remember that as we're going through this presentation, because that's essentially what we think is the crux in our program.
Yes, so this is Matt Burbay speaking now, and what we thought we would start with is showing you what our utility budget looked like in 2009. And the reason we like to show it this way is because you can see there's a couple of key categories there: electricity, natural gas, and water. You know, we have on-site cogeneration here. We have several generators now, but at the time in 2009 when this program started, this was kind of the mix, around $20 million at the time in a total spend on utilities. Fast forwarding, I just submitted the utility budget for 14, and this is what our budget looks like now. You can see there's a couple of additional components there, namely the green. So the green wedge is the budgeted utility amount for CSIP repayments. So this is what John was mentioning. The money now doesn't go out the door on a utility bill. It goes towards the debt service as a project payback. And this number is quite substantial now. It's much more than a sliver in the wedge, as you can see. And that's kind of a key differentiator for us. You know, John and I have the privilege of talking to quite a few folks who manage similar funds. We find that, you know, putting this in the utility budget, not just holding it in a side like holding account, keeps the program much more front and center, and it ties very nicely into the way we manage the M&V and the payback process. So we wanted to start with that to kind of show the finance structure. And then it'll also tie in nicely a little later when we show you how the fund is designed and calibrated year in and year out as we move forward with projects. So what you're looking at here is an energy usage chart. You know, all energy data nerds like to show these kinds of things. So you can see kind of our 1990 to present energy appetite, if you will, for electricity. Notably there on the right, though, you can see the CSIP program starting in 2009. And there is a trend there you can notice of a sort of a leveling off, if you will. But we do want to shed a little light on, you know, not just the energy information, but what the campus is doing in terms of supporting the mission of Caltech and the science we do here. So you can see one more kind of a zoomed in view of our consumption appetite. You can see that over the course of several years, we've the last several years now, this is kind of that flattening out section on the bar chart. Things have leveled off quite a bit. But let me show you the rest of the story now. This is that same strip of time, so 2008 to 13. During this time, a lot of things are happening. So we have new square footage coming. So 2008, 2009, 2010, we have a little flurry of new structures coming online. Notably, though, you see we're calling out the number of fume hoods that are adding to our mix. And then most recently, we also have 2 renovated laboratory spaces. So we're redoing, with gut renovations, existing space. And although these buildings are very energy efficient, they're LEED Gold or LEED Platinum laboratory or support spaces, there are new load to the campus, and specifically the research load, which is the fume hoods. So to give everything the full context, we're showing the big picture of what's going on in the campus that's not directly related to the CSIP or the revolving loan fund, but something that is a concern. I know when we speak to finance folks and folks that want to understand, and hey, well, is your energy consumption going up or down? And you can see here it's not really going down. But what we're going to be talking about is avoided gigawatt hours and avoided cost. And that's the kind of a key terminology that we stick with and have people understand. It ties into the mantra in that, you know, there's a lot of things going on in the campus. We're going to show you the M&V and the methods we do to prove the project performance. But hey, if you just had a 10,000 look view of the consumption charts that we just showed you without the context, it would seem like things weren't working. hey, it would be, Matt, what's going on? You're going up a little bit. I mean, not going up a lot given the number of humans we have here, but we're going up. There's an upward trend. So John and I thought it would be valuable to show that you got to provide the context to support the conversation around the revolving loan fund, not just that we're saving energy, we're finding where the inefficiencies are in the operations, but we got to take everything into account. So here's some of the kind of more fun numbers, the big ticket items we like to call them. So since 2009, we've invested about $14.2 million so far. We've received just under $3 million worth of utility rebates and a few grants related to research and laboratory controls and those types of fun things. And the big number is this, though. We've recorded $4.5 million worth of payback through FY13, so we just booked that a couple weeks ago. And in terms of cash flow management in the revolving loan fund principles, this is the big ticket item here. We're revolving more than $500,000 a quarter now. So to put it in a little bit of context, I have my maintenance hat on. We do maintenance projects as well. We have $3 to $4 million a year worth of maintenance project budgets. So we can work on deferred maintenance items, things like that. Well, right now, I'm revolving into the CSIP cash flow $500,000 a quarter. So that means if you translate that to action, that in theory, if I could develop $500,000 worth of new scope every 3 months, that's a lot of big potential there, and it's only growing. So this is kind of our example chart that shows the power of a functioning revolving loan fund cash flow that's beyond the seed year of the 1 or 2 where you're spending more than you're revolving because you're trying to get things started. We've gone through enough of the growth period where we've made the investments and we've invested in the internal process improvements that support the operations. Now you can see that the reward is here. We have a strong fund that's paying back, and we're able to maximize future investments now and really start getting some even more complex projects to move forward that would seemingly would appear to be beyond the scope of a revolving loan fund that has a 6-year payback criteria. So here's a snapshot of what we thought back in 2009. So when this thing started, we jotted down kind of what a curve might look like. You're looking at cash flow that kind of bottoms out at around $8 million spend, which is offset by cash outflows of the paybacks, on the green line there, and we have incentives from our local utility, and those kind of cap out at a couple $100,000 a year. So this is a simple kind of cash flow analysis. Well, looking into it a little more, we have every year I calibrate the actual outflows. So you can see we spend real quickly, which is very much in line with what the model said, and then also I back off the spending a little bit in years 11 and 12 so we can allow some of the returns to grow. And here's the actual outflow that I calibrate. So you can see when you maximize it now, this curve was just built this year in 13. It's not that dissimilar from what it was in 2009. The only thing that you see is different. We have a crossover point or a break-even point that's a couple years translated to the right. That's predominantly due to the price of natural gas. In 2009, I was paying around $10. Now we're paying in about $4.25. So there's no comparison there. I want cheaper gas hands down to run the cogen, but you have to be real about it. When you do that, it's going to shift your paybacks out because it's all based on the actual avoided cost of electricity. We get a lot of questions about how accurate this kind of thing is. So the utility budget, we want to be as razor accurate as possible for predicting the amount of energy we're going to need. And this 3% variance is just on our last year's roll-up. But in this budget here, one of the differentiating factors is this. We budget in projects that are going to execute over the year. So if I know that in quarter 2, we're going to do a lab rehab and we're going to cut out electricity starting in the quarter, I budget that we're not going to need that electricity in the model. So it's very schedule dependent, but it's also what allows us to be hyper accurate with the forecast. So this isn't just us looking at last year's energy and saying, well, we're going to be 2% more because we're going to grow by some normalized growth number. This includes factors from energy modeling and project scheduling that include future energy reduction. How to make this happen? So we work closely with industry partners, our utility representatives, and we've established clear goals for managing and executing projects, especially in a place like Caltech where we're very research heavy, having detailed training requirements, warranty management, And then most specifically, everyone understanding the vision of the revolving loan fund about how to verify improved savings, how to maintain, and we have to have a 15% return on investment or greater, which translates to a 6-year simple payback, which was the terms we were hearing earlier, and communicating those goals to every partner we work with. There can't be any confusion in this, otherwise it's not going to work. So what's been done and where are we going? So let me just speed up a little bit here. We've picked up the low-hanging fruit, you know, so if I were looking at this in 2009, low-hanging fruit is things like changing light bulbs, you know, dealing with motors on air handlers, things that are behind the scenes to most building occupants, maybe dealing with some free cooling. So this is when we talk about economizers and doing work with damper control so we can ventilate buildings efficiently, not requiring mechanical cooling. We're going much more into deep retrofits now that rely on air site optimization, and specifically in laboratories. You can see the big numbers there, $8 a square foot down to $3. So those numbers are the cost if you were to take a constant volume laboratory with a high air change rate and then do a retrofit, enable demand control ventilation, and achieve 6 air changes and 4 in the occupied and unoccupied modes. So in some cases, we're able to get more than a 50% reduction. It's a pretty powerful statement, and we're seeing those results now. And then finally, coming in the next year, we're going to deal more with chilled water and dealing with our loop. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to fly through this. This is a chance for us Caltech guys to kind of geek out a little bit on engineering. But this is kind of more like Algebra 1 than engineering, but it's still kind of fun. It's all about maximizing delta T. And that's a question for anybody on the webinar today to take back to their plant operating folks. You know, it's just a simple question. What are we doing to maximize delta T on our campus? And that's a takeaway we have for you here today. There's a lot of power in pumping in chiller energy that can be recovered if you try to maximize your delta T. So we'll leave it at that in the interest of time, but maybe write that one down if you're taking a few notes today. This one is not necessarily that hard to achieve and go for. So now the important part, proving it works. We saw earlier today this nice case study we have where Caltech's CSIP program has a nice write-up done on the measurement verification. A big part of the success we've had is due to the in-house business processes to sustain savings and everyone understanding the mantra and the bigger picture. But let me take it from a different angle now. Rather than going through the IPMVP and options and the various options to do retrofit isolation of the things that are standardized, let me show you the real-world practice now. What you're looking at here is an overview page in our building control system that I had built that shows every variable frequency drive we have on campus. So what those are the electronics that can modulate a fan. So when we're saying things like lab retrofits, you have to have a way to vary the fan speed. So these are the devices that enable that action. So to manage it efficiently and to tie it to the sustainable operation, I had this interface built that shows a couple of things. There's some red there and some orange on the graph. So whenever those things go into that condition, my team gets an email that these devices that are related to an energy project are no longer functioning as intended. So any variable frequency drive for any engineer in the room knows that if it's above 95%, especially if it's at 100%, it's meaningless. It's actually costing you more energy than not having it at all. So on paper, having a VFD is a fantastic thing. But they're electronic devices that need to be maintained to a very high operating level, and the configuration of them is equally as important. So that's why we show this here, and we do a roll-up quarterly to support our paybacks to verify the VFDs related to the projects are functioning properly and as designed. Here's another example. Most of these building-controlled retrofits we do now are more complex than an old pneumatic building. So there's electronics. There's all kinds of elaborate engineering sequences to say, shut the system down at 4 p.m. And if it's midnight, purge the air a little bit. And if there's an occupancy sensor that switches on and off, delay it for a half hour before you turn it back on. So there's a lot of configuration and thought that goes into this. Well, this chart here is just a snapshot of the operator interface. So if you go back to your campus, you can try to ask the questions about, how are we tracking configuration changes to these systems? We put a whole process in place to track it because operators are responding to things that come up in the field, whether they be a too hot call or anything else or an airflow issue, and they make the adjustments they think are necessary to make the systems function properly. But if you tie that into the big picture of, hey, there's an ECM that we're relying on a payback for, we're going to try to prove a recordable payback, and these parameters get adjusted, you're going to have trouble. So you're seeing we're approaching this from a very practical operating direction, not just relying on the calculations themselves. So into the active energy management area now, all of our buildings, once we retrofit them, we can match them to a function of temperature. So what that means in English is if we have the equation of a line there, y equals mx plus b, we know that at any given outside air temperature, the building should be using a certain amount of chill water if it's operating efficiently. That's the whole point of doing energy modeling. You figure out the relationship of a building performance over the course of a year to temperature. So here it is. This is a pretty clear line of how that works. And this is the important part that we've latched onto, and we're making some operational decisions based on this curve now. This line right here tells us how efficiently we're operating our buildings. And when you compare that to real operating BTU meter data, if there's any variation, it gives us a reason to go look and hunt down this drift before it wastes money for us. We've actually put a whole process in place with our operating team to manage that. So we're not going to belabor it here, but you can see those are typical items there that maintenance guys understand. Too hot call, too cold call, loss of control, sensor not reading. That pull-down menu is something that we programmed into our building management system. I told the controls partners we work with, put this in when you program the building. Give me a pull-down menu that when the operator goes and has to make an adjustment, he has to tell us why it's happening. So not just so it's related to a work order that eventually we can hunt down. I want it in the control system so they can show us that, yep, there was a call here that's going to make me change the system so it will no longer be the same as you modeled it. We have to acknowledge that variation and then hunt down why it is and if it has to stay that way. And if it has to stay that way, then that means the savings we're going to record are going to be adjusted as well.
Before we turn it over to large questions, I just want to make sure that everyone understands that this what you're seeing and what you just saw is a process of 5 years of Matt and I working, nonstop on this problem and this challenge. We started out very humbly, and we started out with a simple LED lighting swap out in a parking garage. $20,000 project, something along those lines, and so we built this system. So, lest you think we snapped our fingers and this turned out, it's not that way. So, never fear, I guess, is the bottom line.
That's right.
With that, Rob, Joe, we up for questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, guys from Caltech, John and Matt, and also thank you, Joe, for those great presentations. That was really informative. We've got some great questions from the audience here we're going to get to in just a second. But I did want to remind everybody that this presentation, both the audio and the slideshow, are going to be up on AASHE's website probably a few days after this presentation ends. And that's going to be on their events page under the webinars section. So starting off here, we've got a few questions more in depth about what's going on at Caltech. The first one is, are projects bundled to improve the overall payback? For example, lighting with boilers or windows.
Hi, yes, a good question. This is Matt Burbay, Caltech. Absolutely. We do project bundling. It is on a case-by-case basis. I do prefer to have standalone projects as possible. And I'll say that early on in the program management here, we did bundle them more. That gives you a little bit of kind of more buying power, I guess you could think about it that way. If you put lighting with a heavier mechanical job, you can make the things work. Where it gets a little bit tricky, and you got to be careful, is that if you're doing, for us, projects across multiple buildings, you want to make sure that you have your M&B parameters clear enough so that when you roll everything up for a payback, it's clear that, yep, lighting is recorded as this, HVAC is recorded as that, and then you can differentiate it when you're trying to make sure things are working properly. You can't just put it all in the big box and say this is the number. There's too many ways it could go wrong.
Excellent. Thanks. That's a great answer. The next question, let's start with Joe answering this, and then either Matt or John, if you have something to add, jump in. But the question is, can the IPMVP, so those measurement and verification protocols, be applied to a behavioral change program in order to compare that program with a typical energy efficiency retrofit project, so to speak, during a year?
Yeah, I think at a high level, the IPMVP protocol is designed to be kind of a framework for thinking about how to measure and verify, generally speaking. So while it is targeted at equipment-based efficiency measures, I think that many of the principles could be applied to behavior change. But I'd be curious to hear what the Caltech folks think about that as well.
This is Matt. Just from the hip. The gut reaction was that it probably wouldn't work. But now that hearing your explanation and thinking about it a little more, I'm with you. If you did say option C, and you were looking at the whole building, right? So you're just looking at the building benchmarking trend. Then you made a focused effort to say have people close fume hoods or turn lights off or turn off plug loads. You could do IPMVP and see the results on the behavioral change because it's measurable if you were looking at the whole building. I mean, you could also do isolation if you looked at particular labs, if you had it circuited that way. So you can make the leap, I think, but you'd have to really know what the behavior was intending to accomplish, not just hope that it was going to produce a saving somewhere because it had to be kind of specific, I guess.
Excellent. That's great. We just got a question in here that we get a lot, so I want to make sure that we get our panelists today to answer it. The question is, what is the short payback? What if all of these short payback projects have already been implemented at an institution, and it's only sort of looking at the longer payback investments that have yet to be made in terms of the quote-unquote low-hanging fruit already being picked, so to speak. And maybe Caltech, if you want to talk about your experience with that, and then we can hear from Joe, and I might chime in as well about the broader picture.
Sure. Just a couple of things that come to mind on that. When we first started and we were going at such a fast pace going through what we call low-hanging fruit, so, like lighting and motors and things, there's always a concern that you're going to, I guess, run out of stuff to do. And we've heard that challenge from many of our colleagues, hey, well, we can't find things to invest in that meet our payback criteria. Well, when and if you get to that point, then for us, we've been stepping back and looking at, well, what's in the payback and how heavy or light is the effort to compile the project. So let me give you an example. We're able to do whole building laboratory VAV conversions that fit within a 6-year payback. And it's not because we have, exorbitantly high utility rates. I mean, true, they are high. I mean, we're in California, but it's not because they're like, double the nation's or anything like that. We step back and look at the process we take to design it. We get a little innovative with our design build practices, and we take more streamlined approach to project development. And we've not come across retrofits yet that we have not been able to make within this 6-year hurdle. Even when initially we thought, hey, we're going to run out of the low-hanging things to do. You have to kind of step back and look at how you develop the work, how much you're going to pay for, how much you make your business partners do at risk, and those kinds of tougher kind of strategy questions, and then push the fund forward.
Yeah, just to add to that, this is Joe. I think that's a question that we hear come up all the time. I think one key point to make is there's nothing innate about a green revolving fund that stops working properly once the low-hanging fruit has been eaten up. In fact, we've seen several funds kind of transition into that mode over time as the initial 2 or 3 year payback projects get eaten up. Harvard and their GRF is a great example of that. And I think it's also important to do kind of continuing monitoring of what your opportunities are, because if you're operating a fund over multiple years, technologies change, best practices change. There's a lot of exciting development in the lighting industry right now, for example, with LEDs. So if you did an energy audit 3 or 4 years ago and you found that there were no high payback projects remaining, that situation may well have changed a few years into the future. So just something to think about.
This is Rob. Those are great answers. Just wanted to also hop in and say that for institutions who are coming into maybe thinking about starting a green revolving fund, but they've already picked a lot of that low-hanging fruit. Of course, there's always, technology is always making other opportunities become available, but a lot of those institutions alter the structure of their fund in terms of how they evaluate potential project opportunities to look at things like lifetime costs so that they can understand the value that a green revolving fund would still have to pick sort of medium and higher hanging fruit. And other schools that are in those situations might also think about their payback models, maybe having 80% of the annual savings each year replenished to the fund, so that 20% is going to the operating budget, so that those higher hanging fruit projects are a sort of longer term investment in both not just a green revolving fund to have projects revolve within it, but an investment in the institution's overall financial health. So schools that are in those situations look at their fund structures a little differently than a school that might just be getting started.
And real quick, this is Matt Burbay. One more thought that they're out there too is, as the funds mature and as your experience with deploying projects increases, there's synergies that kind of begin to materialize. Aligning the revolving loan fund efforts with a 5-year plan for capital renewal or deferred maintenance replacement. You can, if your fund goals and guidelines allows it, you can line up, say, a planned investment in an air handler replacement with a building VAV direct visual controls upgrade. So, on CSIP, we'll pay for the incremental amount that will enable the type of sequences and energy reduction we require in our design. But if the base hardware is already funded in a infrastructure renewal plan, there's some synergies there that can really make this thing pop, and then you can have some alignment that you can really add the value in.
Excellent. That's a great point. We've gotten so many great questions today, and we're going to, I think, respond to a few of those via, or most of those if we can, via email. I did want to close out with just one more question that we got that's a good one about rolling metering plans. Asking, this was during Joe's presentation, so Joe, if you want to speak first, and then Matt or John from Caltech. But the question is, can you talk more in the context of M&V and submetering about what a rolling metering plan is and how this could be implemented on a campus with a central plant that has no submetering for separate buildings?
Sure. Well, I was actually inspired to mention that by referencing Caltech's rolling metering plan. So we have 2 guys on the phone who are actually actively managing one of these things. But just generally, that when conducting M&V, it's typically not a good idea to approach projects on a one-by-one basis. You need to ensure that the meters are there and ensure that, because the capital planning process can be extraordinarily long. I mean, it can take 3, 4, 5 years of discussing a project before it finally gets implemented. It typically isn't a very nimble process. So having a rolling metering plan that kind of goes alongside your capital plan and also goes alongside maybe your 5-year plan for your green revolving fund can be a very useful tool. But I'll let Matt and John cover that in more detail.
Yeah, I mean, you described it very well. I mean, it's really just having the metering data. Not having it is a difficult challenge to overcome. So we've structured a wedge of the revolving loan fund for metering. So that means say I know the next 5 buildings I'm going to do some kind of project in, and I may or may not have BTU meters. I have electric meters. I'm fortunate that way, but I don't have thermal, so heating and cooling. So strategically, we install those meters via a plan that's funded from the revolving loan fund, where I know that the cost of those meters are going to be transferred to the project once we do the project. So again, that's a little subtle maneuver we've done. It's a strategy so that we have the meter data we need in advance of us going through the detailed engineering in a particular building. But the cost of the meter is going to be paid back with the total project cost once we get there in our plan.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to stress that that's how we do it now. Our very first projects, we bore the cost of metering with our facilities operational budget.
Yep.
So that's not how we first started, but now that's the way we're operating today.
Excellent. Thanks. Those are great answers to everybody. We're going to wrap up here to make sure that we're respecting everybody's time, but I want to thank our presenters and all of the attendees, as well as AASHE for technically putting this webinar on. Reminder to everybody about the AASHE conference next week. Look online about that. And thank you, everybody, and then we'll be in touch with answers to as many of the questions we can that we weren't able to answer today. So have a great day.